couple more minutes. All right, that is my cue. Well, hello and welcome everyone to today's training. My name is Hope Rogers. My pronouns are she, hers. I am the CoC Performance Manager with Texas Homeless Network. Welcome to part one of a two-part training series that we are so excited to host in partnership with the Texas Council on Family Violence. This is, again, part one of a two-part training series. Part two will occur on December 6th. If you haven't already registered for that, I will be sharing the link in the chat a little bit later in the presentation. A couple of quick housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel a bit later today if you'd like to revisit it later or share with your colleagues and staff. And I will also be sharing the PowerPoint materials in the chat that you can download and follow along after I introduce our wonderful trainers. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our trainers from Texas Council on Family Violence. If you could please join me in welcoming Brielle Backus, Public Policy Coordinator, Molly Thibodeau, Public Policy Manager, and Jen Mudge, Public Policy Coordinator. And with that, I will turn it over to them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hope. I'm Molly Thibodeau with the Texas Council on Family Violence, she, her pronouns. We are very excited to be here. We've been working with THN for a long time and really appreciate the collaboration along the way. And we're really excited to get to talk to all of you about serving survivors, some best practices, and because you intersect with a lot of survivors that you might not even know. So we're hoping we can kind of build up some of your skills and offer some basic information and understanding. But as Hope mentioned, I'm Molly Thibodeau. I would love for you all to use the chat throughout to ask questions, as well as introduce yourself right now with your name and where you're from and the organization, maybe the town or area in Texas that you serve. But as Hope mentioned, this is part one of a two-part series. And Jen or Brielle, would y'all like to offer any introductions? And Hope, I know Hope offered that for us, but I didn't know if y'all wanted to say hello or.
Can do just a quick intro. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Mudge, she, her pronouns. Yeah, I'm happy to be here with you all today. Work on the policy team with Brielle and Molly, and come from a background of advocacy with domestic and sexual assault survivors, and have a background in social work, and been with TCFV for a couple of years now. So thanks for having us. We'll look forward to spending some time together today.
Hi, I'm Brielle Backus, she, her pronouns as well. I've been at TCFV for about 3.5 years. You'll hear a lot more from me in part two when we do a little deeper dive. So I'm going to let Jen and Molly take you through this part one, but happy to be in community with all of you today. So I'll give it back to Molly.
All right. Thanks. And as Jen mentioned, Brielle and Jen and myself, we work on the policy team, specifically the program policy team here at TCFV, and support the family violence programs around the state with technical assistance and training and all kinds of good stuff that we help support those local programs. So we're hoping to, as part of this, also to introduce you on how to get in touch with some of those programs. And, if you need help connecting, we'll kind of talk about that too. So we've got a lot of great information that I'm hoping is meaningful and that you can walk away with some tangible things today. And so on the next slide, I just wanted to give you a brief overview. I'm not going to interview you over the webinar, but just kind of where we're going today. I'll introduce you a little bit more about Texas Council on Family Violence. We'll get into intimate partner violence, some definitions, basics, dynamics, and all the different terminology that can be used for intimate partner violence that you might see or know. And Jen will talk a little more around the impact of trauma. We'll also look and take a deeper dive into the intersection of housing, homelessness, and intimate partner violence. And we have IPV as the acronym there. And disclosure and best practices for response. So, we'll talk through when someone does disclose, what might be some best practices on how to respond. And then, as I mentioned, introduce you to some of the local family violence programs and how to refer, kind of what to expect when you do refer someone, so you could be able to explain that, and the resources on how to connect. All right, and then the next slide is just kind of our boilerplate about TCFV. So we're a statewide domestic violence coalition. Every state has a statewide domestic violence coalition, and we're based in Austin, but we serve the whole state of Texas. And we have a policy team, as I mentioned. We also have, in addition to housing, we focus on health and mental health, confidentiality, privacy, data collection and reporting. We have a child welfare focus, immigration, economic justice. There's a lot of different areas that we focus on in policy and how that intersects with survivors and programs that serve survivors. And we also have a prevention team, and we also have a support to service provider team. And we all have different roles in supporting the programs around the state and improving safety and increasing safety for survivors throughout the state through all those efforts. And so, okay. And with that, and I'll drop our website into the chat if you want to take a look at that. And we'll be referring to the website a little more throughout the presentation as well. But with that, I'll pass it over to Jen.
All right, thanks, Molly. Can go ahead to the next slide. So a lot of you out there may be familiar already with intimate partner violence or domestic violence. We kind of use those terms somewhat interchangeably, but a definition, there's a lot of different definitions out there, but that vary slightly, but I like this one from the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma and Mental Health that describes it as an ongoing pattern of power and control exerted by one partner over another in a romantic relationship, enforced by the use of abusive tactics. So we can go ahead to the next slide. But in Texas, we define it in our state statute and code as family violence, and that's in section 71004. If you ever wanted to get into some some code. But just so you're aware of how the state defines it here, we've got the definition here on the slide, as an act by a member of the family or household against another member of the family or household. It's intended to result in physical harm or bodily injury or assault or sexual assault, or is something that's a threat that reasonably places that person in fear of imminent harm, injury, or assault or sexual assault. It also includes abuse of a child, and it does include dating violence. So maybe folks are not the member of the same household, not living together, but in a relationship. So just to point that out as something extra context here for what it means in our state. All right, we can go ahead forward. So we know that here in Texas, 1 in 3 folks living in our state will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. This is a rate that's slightly higher than the national rate, particularly for women who are survivors. So we know a lot of folks this is their lived experience. You can go ahead forward. And we do want to point out it is tough to talk about, and I will say that if at any point something in this training today is too much for you, if it's upsetting or triggering, please take care of yourself, take a break. But we do want to point out the reality of what can happen with intimate partner violence is that it does result in homicide for some. 204 Texans were killed by their intimate partners in 2021. TCFV puts out an annual report called Honoring Texas Victims, And we've recently put out our report this year. And there's a link there in the slide, and you'll get these. I think you already have these slides in the chat to look into this further if this is something you want to know more about. But 169 women and 35 men were killed. And I do just want to point out a few things that stand out in this year's report. We know that many victims are killed by a firearm. This year, 75% of the women who were killed with a firearm. So it's the most common means of death. We also saw a rise in the number of LGBTQ plus Texans that were killed by their current or former intimate partner this year, 12. In the 5 prior years combined, there were 17 deaths of folks in the LGBTQ community. So that was significant. And I just want to point out some of the factors that place survivors at a higher risk of being killed. If someone is has experienced strangulation, has been strangled, if their partner is making threats of suicide, of course, access to firearms, as I was talking about just a minute ago. Abuse that begins during pregnancy is a risk factor. Also recent job loss by the abusive partner. And we know that separation is a dangerous time too, especially in the first few weeks or days when a person is leaving. So I just want to point out too that, although we may, I think there's sometimes a lot of pressure on survivors that, why don't you just leave? And, but that's actually a very dangerous time for a survivor when they're thinking about leaving or when they've actually left. A lot of the victims had taken steps. Among these 204, many had taken steps to end their relationship or seek interventions to enhance their safety. So just spending a few moments here so that to raise up some of those risk factors as we kind of move into the next slide, where we're talking about some of the tactics that an abusive partner might use to have power and control over someone, and then kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, the equality wheel. So I'll pass it over to Molly to talk about this for a moment.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks so much for bringing up, what a heavy subject this is and how it can be personal. We saw the statistics there on how many people it affects in Texas and nationally in the world. And so, please do take care of yourself and feel free to reach out to me or other TCFV staff, during the call, or like Jen mentioned, step away, take a break, take care of yourself. So thank you for bringing that up, Jen. I appreciate that. So in the chat, I would love to see a yes or a no if you have seen either the power and control wheel or the equality wheel. So just type in yes or no. I want to just kind of get an idea of if people have yes or no, or okay. Kind of mixed. All right, great. Thank y'all. Well, this was developed a long time ago, the power and control wheel, but I also like to pair that with the equality wheel, which demonstrates, some aspects of healthy relationships and what that might look like. And, as Jen mentioned, we view domestic violence as a pattern of behaviors used to gain or maintain power and control. And so, at the center of that is the power and control. And then you see the kind of the cogs around the power and control, using intimidation or using emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, blaming, using children, using male privilege, or using economic abuse, coercion and threats. And then that is all supported on the outer ring with physical and sexual violence, which is reinforced sometimes when some of the other tactics might not work, or that's just part of that experience. And this does not depict everyone's experience. These are just some examples of what that might look like. And it can never be completely summarized or in a single diagram, but this presents a useful lens through which to examine, domestic violence. And so, this was developed by some folks in Duluth, Minnesota, and lots of interviews with survivors, and is used throughout battering intervention prevention programs, and kind of the way that we approach some of that. So just wanted to show y'all these wheels and introduce you to that. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Jen. She's going to dive a little deeper into some of what this might look like.
Okay, thanks, Molly. So some of what Molly was pointing out there that's in the power and control wheel, it falls into these different types of abuse that a person might experience. Sometimes we think of domestic violence as physical or maybe sexual abuse, but it can include many different types of abuse: psychological abuse, mental, verbal abuse, technological abuse, the abusive partner tracking where that person is going, putting, GPS on their phone and having access to their social media, their email, monitoring that. It can be spiritual in nature. It can be preventing that person from practicing the religion that they want, or forcing them to practice a certain way, or making them even, question, what is my purpose and meaning in life? And we also see a lot of financial abuse. And of course, this makeup is different for each person who experiences intimate partner violence, but we do see financial abuse or economic abuse frequently, where an abusive partner, has control of the finances for the household, or for the, both partners, prevent someone from working, maybe even stalking them at their workplace so that they're not able to keep their employment, running up debt on a credit card, using the person's name, to put accounts in their name, things like that. So, which we know can contribute to somebody not being able to leave a relationship, or being in a difficult financial position if they do leave, which, we can see how that could, lead to, instances of homelessness. So this is just to point out the different forms that abuse can take, and that can look different for each person. Go ahead forward. And I did want to point out too how someone's mental health and use of substances could be used against them by their abusive partner. These are some examples of ways that an abusive partner might use, if someone has a mental health condition or is using substances, how their partner might use that against them. By controlling their medications or the type of treatment that they can seek. Maybe they're forcing them to use substances or to engage in certain illegal activities. Certainly it can be used to undermine somebody's sense of sanity, their credibility in interacting with systems. If there's a court case going on, child custody is being decided, certainly that's something that could be used against a survivor. Sharing this information with different systems, or with friends and family, or using that information against the survivor, or gaslighting them, which is a term that means someone's reality is being invalidated, that somebody is challenging another person's perceptions or memories of what's happening, which is really a form of psychological manipulation. So I just wanted to highlight this, and we can go ahead to the next slide just to kind of drive this point home. That there was a survey done with survivors through the National Domestic Violence Hotline, along with the National Center on DV Trauma and Mental Health, that asked survivors about their experiences with around mental health coercion. Over 2,500 survivors, and many of them were experiencing this. Almost half of the survivors said that their partner tried to prevent them or discourage them from getting treatment, or getting the prescribed meds that they needed. Half the survivors said, their partner threatened to report them to the authorities or call them, quote, crazy. So we know this is something that's happening frequently too. So I think it's important to know about. because we also don't want to compound any messages that an abusive partner is giving to a survivor. We don't want to kind of play into those messages or kind of like, reinforce messages of power and control. All right. You're going to move forward, but just a reminder, if anything's coming up, you can drop it in the chat. You can drop questions, comments in the chat. We're going to try to leave some time at the end for questions, but feel free to drop some things in the chat if something's coming up for you. All right, so I'm going to move into talking about trauma and the effects of trauma in the next few slides here. So I did see in the chat that some of y'all are working in mental health, so this may be familiar for some of you. But just to put a definition on trauma, again, there's different definitions out there, but this one I'm using here is that a hallmark of traumatic experience is that it typically overwhelms a person mentally, emotionally, physically. It's something that is physically or emotionally harmful, life-threatening, whether that's real or perceived, and really can create profound and lasting changes in the person's physiological makeup, arousal, emotions, cognition, and memory. Okay, go ahead forward. So we know that there is a link between intimate partner violence and trauma. This stat here is looking at women who are survivors, but 80% of women who've experienced rape or stalking or physical violence from their intimate partner have reported significant shorter long-term effects like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And as people experience multiple victimizations, different types of victimizations, that really does enhance their risk of mental health issues and substance use. And we know from research in our state, fairly recent from our 2019 Texas state plan, that 69% of Texas survivors met the criteria for a PTSD diagnosis. And then compare that to the national rate of 51%. So it's prevalent here in our state. Go ahead forward. And these are just some of the possible impacts of trauma on survivors, physical impacts, the emotional and psychological impacts, the impacts on relationships, and these can all interact and affect one another. If you're having a physical and emotional impact of disconnecting from your body or dissociating from yourself, not being able to kind of be in your body and feel that, it may affect your relationships with other people and your ability to connect. So I won't go through all of these here, but you'll have these slides, but just to kind of highlight the intersecting impacts within the person that trauma can have. And we know that trauma is stored in the body, and it affects how we behave, how we interact with others. And I just point out this little graphic on the side of the slide here that kind of describes what happens to us when we are experiencing trauma or are reliving a trauma through a trigger. Most of the time, if we're in a calm state, we're kind of in this window of tolerance, that yellow area, where you kind of feel like you can deal with what's happening in life. Maybe you're a little stressed, but it's not getting to you too much, and it's kind of a calm baseline. But if we're experiencing trauma, or if we're triggered by something that makes us feel unsafe or threatened, we can go into the red or the blue zone here. So the red is hyperarousal, where we're kind of in a fight or flight mode. You may have heard that, and as a response to trauma, the fight, flight, or freeze. So hyperarousal is kind of the fight or flight, where we might be anxious, we might feel angry, might feel out of control or overwhelmed. Your body may want to fight or run away. And in hypoarousal, the person may become spacey, kind of zoned out or numb or frozen, maybe wanting to shut down. And it's important to point out that these are states, the hyperarousal, the hypoarousal, where it's happening automatically. The brain is reacting to a potential threat. The frontal, the prefrontal cortex, where all of our higher level functioning, our decision making, and even some of our language, it's shutting down, and kind of other parts of the brain are taking over. So this is something that a person's not choosing. They're not choosing to have that reaction. It's just happening. And we know that there's also a reaction called fawning that's been coming out more recently. This is something that's been recognized as a trauma response when somebody is seeking to appease or please others to avoid a conflict, or really as a way to stay safe. And I have a couple books here listed on the slide if you want to do a deeper dive into how trauma is stored in the body. But we can go ahead forward. And this just looks a little more closely at those trauma responses, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and how that might look when you're interacting with somebody who's kind of in that mode. When we're interacting with somebody in that fight mode, they might seem really impulsive or uncompromising, that they're lashing out. Somebody who's in flight mode might kind of seem kind of lost or distant, maybe aloof, or maybe they're distracting themselves with some other things, like kind of, with work, like a workaholic. Someone in freeze mode might seem, like they're isolating, they're being reclusive, disinterested. And someone in fawn mode might seem like a people pleaser or an entertainer even, or someone who's, conflict avoidant. So it's just something to think about when we're interacting with the folks we're serving. If somebody is appearing this way frequently to you, it might be a moment to pause and think, is this a trauma response that's coming out? Okay. So again, some other ways that we might be seeing trauma show up for folks that we're working with, or anyone really who's gone through a traumatic experience. These are just some examples of what it might look like. Sometimes I definitely heard this when I was working with an advocate, and I know I've been guilty of thinking, oh man, this person, they set these goals for themselves, but now they seem really disinterested in working on it. Like they just want to kind of be in their room and sleep. When I was working in a shelter, I wonder what's, sometimes those thoughts would come in, but understanding trauma a little bit better, start to think, well, maybe that person is kind of in flight mode, or maybe the trauma has led to some depression showing up. So these are just examples of ways that trauma can come up. And when we see these things happening, if somebody seems suspicious or distrustful of the staff, or they're avoiding certain activities, maybe they seem to not be able to remember things very well, or seem a little scattered, lacking energy or motivation. These are all opportunities for us to pause and to just, maybe to be curious, and to maybe have some conversation with that client or that person to see what might really be going on, what might be underneath, and to kind of look at what's happening through a trauma-informed lens. All right, we can go ahead forward. And I just like this post as an Instagram post, and some other ways that trauma responses can come out in folks. Things like saying yes because you're scared of losing security or feeling empty, seeking escapism, giving into reckless impulses. So just some more examples of things to, if we're seeing it in the folks that we're working with, to pause and to take a deeper look. All right. So I did want to point out too, and this is something that y'all may or may not be aware of, but that the trauma certainly has rippling impacts. This slide here represents some data that we Some results that we found through our 2019 state plan that I referenced earlier, that when survivors had trauma symptoms, it was significantly correlated with all of these little bubbles that you see here. So decreased social support, more experiences of homelessness, higher rates of economic abuse and instability, increased rates of disability. So something like a traumatic brain injury, which we're starting to see through research is more common than we thought. And increased reproductive coercion. So an abusive partner controlling somebody's choices around their reproductive health, like if they can use contraception or not, or decisions around whether to become pregnant or stay pregnant, or so yeah, I just wanted to point out that these kind of rippling impacts that we've seen that survivors can experience. All right, so I've talked for quite a while, and we can go ahead and we're gonna watch a brief video. It's like 6 minutes, but it's a woman who is a survivor describing some of her experiences. And I just wanna ask you to listen for a couple things as you watch the video, to just listen for how the trauma that she describes, that she experienced, how that affected her. And to just also listen for how the systems that she was involved with, how they treated her and how that impacted her. So how her trauma impacted her and how the systems treated her. So we can go ahead forward and share that. Sorry for the cheesy beginning here.
Well, as a child, I was sexually abused, married off to an older man at a very young age, experiencing domestic violence. I was a victim of neglect and abandonment by my mother, so I was always treated like I was worthless, and this is how things supposed to be happen in my life. And I needed to find a way to cope with my reality. I mean, at age 9, I was experiencing sexuality that you're not even supposed to. Who do that to a 9-year-old? Moving into foster care, taken from foster care by my mom, just so she can marry me off to an older man who beat me constantly. I needed to find a way to cope with that, or I would have killed myself. And I used drugs and alcohol to do it. Unfortunately for me, it introduced me to different public health systems. In a mental health institution, I was always thrown into seclusion. One of the worst things you can do to somebody that's a victim of neglect and abandonment. One of the worst things, because that's how I was always treated by my mother. And now you're gonna do it? So when someone come with their tray of medication or tray of food, I smacked it out of my face, because the only thing I know to do is to tap into my survival mode, because no one has taught me to do anything different. No one has identified, addressed, or treat my trauma, so I do the only thing I know to do, and that is to tap into my survival mode. And my survival mode has always told me to fight, because I didn't know there was any other way. So I did what I had to do to cope, and sometimes somebody might got hit with the tray when I smacked it. So now they're calling a code and they're throwing me down to the ground, restraining me, a rape victim, holding me down and restraining me. Somebody that has been held down and raped multiple times, doing more harm, causing more trauma, but because my chart says that I'm a crazy crackhead, the stigma, that's what they go by. That's what they go by. And unfortunately, I was re-traumatized, taking me even further away from the possibility of healing and recovery. I was a desperate child, still trying to tell somebody what happened to me. Still trying to find somebody safe enough to tell what happened to me. You know, we go to these facilities and they give us these tidbits of good information, but most of us have so much trauma packed so tightly, the bits and pieces of information can't get down there to get rooted. We got to get the stuff out of us so we can get the good stuff in us, so we can change our belief system, because once our belief system change, our thought process change, and we start to make the best decisions in our life. We can't do that if you still believe that we're a crazy crackhead. 2004, I was in prison with my daughter, and I was terrified I was about to lose another baby. I didn't know how I was going to do that. And they kept telling me about a program that addressed your trauma and help you with your addiction and your mental health. I said, well, I'm all those things, and I'm pregnant. And but you know what? I still didn't really have that. I didn't have high hopes. I did it because I wanted to keep my daughter. I didn't do it for anything else, because they sent me to so many different programs, one where I was court ordered and the drug counselor raped me. So how do I believe that anything would work? Really? You court ordered me to a program where I graduate and I was doing well, and then when I went back for aftercare, the counselor raped me. So I really didn't have high hopes after 19 years ago in and out of the systems that I could do better, but all I could see was me trying to keep my daughter. And when I walked through the doors of Tamar's Children, somebody said, I'm so glad you're here. After 19 years of people shaking their head in disgust at me and just saying, you're just a crazy crackhead, and hurting me over and over again, somebody told me they were glad to see me. And yes, they did. They dug deep and they worked with me one-on-one to help me to deal with what happened to me, not what was wrong with me, but what happened to me. And they did it right, and it was a one-stop shop, because understanding that I was homeless, they made sure I had a housing grant. They made sure somebody was attached to the housing grant that came out and visited me once a week to help me to create a budget and make sure that I was taking care of the property and my daughter. And I was okay with that. Some women say, oh, they all up in my business. I needed somebody to be up in my business. And they weren't judgmental. They understood. And they helped me. Truly breaking the cycle, because that's what the real picture is about. Yeah, treat my trauma, or, remove the stigma to keep me out of your system. Yes, love that. But did you know that doing that was going to break the cycle for my daughter? She would be able to be given what she was given as a result. So we look at a whole different path from here on out for my daughter and her kids and their kids. I got to understand that it's a lot to do with what happened to an individual and how people were raised up or trained up. And then I could understand my job is try to educate them to remove the stigma, to understand the impact that trauma has on the individual. So instead of taking it on that, oh, you guys are awful. Well, don't get me wrong, I tell them when they're awful though. But I also know that where there's breath, there's hope. Where there's breath, there's hope. Everybody has room to get better. I'm a living proof of that.
There we go. All right. So feel free to drop into the chat. Let me come back on video here. Anything you noticed about how the trauma affected her and how the systems that she was interacting with, how they treated her. You come off mute too if you'd like to just share it out loud. But we'd love to see in the chat too anything that you noticed. I can say, just point out a couple things that stood out to me is that, I think some of the things that she mentioned that made a difference for her was that somebody was glad to see her, and that even just someone being non-judgmental made a difference for her, and that somebody asked her what happened instead of thinking like what's wrong with you. So those were a few things that stood out. I do see in the chat, yeah, Mary, yeah, absolutely. She talked about people paying more attention to her labels than who she really was. Yeah, and as we talk about just a few slides here on trauma-informed care, it's absolutely a piece of trauma-informed care is seeing people as people and not as a diagnosis or as a label. Yeah, Gabby, love that education contributed to breaking the generational cycle. Yeah. Yeah, that's something that was huge for her. John said her providers sounded not judgmental and treated her trauma instead of focusing on her current symptoms. Yeah, that somebody met with her one-on-one and really focused on working on the trauma. Yeah, thank you for sharing in the chat. I'm just going to share a few slides here about trauma-informed care. Yes, I see you, Wendy, breaking the generational cycle. And Mary, never getting to the root of the issue just compounded the hurt. Yeah. Thank you. So some of the things that made a difference for Trinier, or things that could have earlier on, maybe for her, were some of these trauma-informed care principles. These are the ones that the CDC and SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, that they have as the principles they put out. So of course, safety is in there, creating environments and creating an atmosphere where people feel not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. We also see trustworthiness and transparency in there, so that the organization, the agencies and the systems that clients are interacting with are transparent in how they're operating, but also that we as individual service providers are being transparent with folks and being clear about what we can and can't provide and our boundaries, so that we can help to build trust with the people that we're working with. Peer support is huge. We know that peer support and mutual self-help among clients or survivors are really key in establishing safety and even feelings of hope and building trust and community. It can really help in the healing process. We also know that collaboration and mutuality is huge, that we're working together with survivors or with the clients you're serving, working alongside them instead of a top-down model where we're saying you need to do this on your goals, you need to have this as a goal, but really working to understand what people's needs are and what they want out of services and what their needs are, and how you all want to work together on that. And that feeds into, empowerment, voice, and choice, focusing on people's strengths, and those are recognized and built upon, and that people are feeling validated and they have a chance to develop skills and work on the things that they want to work on. And of course, cultural, historical, and gender issues too, all acknowledging where a person is coming from, and how organizations or even us as individuals, the stereotypes and biases that we hold, and being able to interrogate those, and really working to offer services that are culturally responsive, that when possible are available in the person's language of choice, and services that recognize historical trauma as well. We can go ahead forward. So again, just some of those principles coming out here, and at the bottom row there, you can see some of the principles in practice, some of the things that we can do as service providers, as folks working alongside our clients and alongside survivors, some things that we can put into practice. And I think I covered some of this in the last slide, so we could go ahead forward. And just thinking about things that can re-traumatize. And Tonier mentioned a bunch of these in her experiences, that, she was definitely treated as a label. She at one point said, she was being treated as a quote, crazy crackhead. Certainly she seemed to be dealing with systems that just didn't understand trauma, that didn't have enough information about trauma responses. So that's something that was re-traumatizing. Certainly, she described that experience of a service provider violating her sexually, which is a very extreme example. But all of these things that you see here are pieces of what we can see happen that can re-traumatize somebody when we're not kind of intentionally building that trauma-informed care environment. All right, so I am going to pass it over to Molly to talk about the intersection of housing and homelessness in IPB.
Thanks so much, Jen. I really appreciate you going over all that in depth and giving folks a better understanding of what it can look like and how it, some of the behaviors and other pieces that show up. So thank you for that. So we're moving into the intersection of housing, homelessness, and intimate partner violence. And so, excuse me, housing stability and economic stability are tied to survivor safety. Survivors have unique safety concerns, excuse me, and complex needs that arise from risks posed by abusers, as well as the effects of domestic violence. And so, certain times specific services aren't necessarily provided by the general, transitional housing or rapid rehousing, housing assistance type programs for unhoused people. And so, that this is why we think it's so important for you all as housing professionals and providers to have relationships with and know who the local programs are in your area and be able to connect those survivors who want to reach out to a program, to be able to do that in a way that's going to work for everyone. So, just kind of highlighting that, there are some unique safety pieces and different types of supportive services that are customized and tailored for family violence victims and their families. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide, and just kind of want to show you the national statistics first. And so, housing has only grown as a need for survivors. It's made worse through the economic and eviction crisis, brought on by the pandemic. And, what national statistics show is around 80% plus of moms with children experiencing homelessness have previously experienced domestic violence, so over 80%. And excuse me, for when folks do reach out for services, they're needing 51% are needing and wanting support and advocacy related to their housing or issues with landlords. And so, that's over half. And then, the last piece, when survivors do reach out, programs have a certain capacity and number of resources and funding and things like that. And so 64% of survivors who reached out were looking for housing and emergency shelter, and those requests went unmet. So, that's 64% of folks calling a hotline looking for assistance or emergency shelter. And so those requests were unmet. And you can go to the next slide. And so for survivors accessing services in Texas, the first two boxes come from the Health and Human Services Commission Family Violence Program. And so, over 1,700 calls a day happen. People are calling over, 1,700 times to a domestic violence hotline in Texas for help. And then, survivor around 6,437 survivors receive residential and non-residential services from Texas domestic violence organizations. And so, residential would be emergency shelter, and then non-residential is, they don't necessarily live in shelter, but might come to the center for services. And there's a variety of different types of services that could be non-residential. And then lastly, through the National Network to End Domestic Violence. Every year they do a domestic violence count survey. And in Texas, 1,122 unmet requests for services. There were 1,122 requests that we were unable to meet. And, as I mentioned earlier, it goes back to capacity and resources and funding. So, unfortunately, those go back to the housing and emergency shelter requests. And that's what those are specifically. And you can go to the next slide. And then I have a few more statistics. We love our statistics over here. So, and these are Texas survivor interviews. So Jen mentioned the Texas state plan earlier. And so data from that revealed, 71.4% of survivors needed help finding housing. We find this as the most unmet need of survivors, one of the most unmet needs for survivors. And, around 69% wanted help getting into permanent housing. That was a really big problem, was finding permanent housing. And 32.7% needed help keeping their current housing. So, rental assistance or landlord negotiation or engagement. And then 1 in 3 to 4, homeless women report domestic violence as a major contributor to housing problems. And then 90.1% experienced homelessness at least once after escaping domestic violence. And then, about half of that, 45%, experienced homelessness twice or more due to domestic violence. So I know, the general homeless provider service providers, experience a lot of, the same constraints with funding and resources and inventory of safe and affordable housing. This just kind of highlights, the need for Texas survivors that were interviewed, as well as, in addition, factoring in those supportive services that are helpful and kind of show promise in helping survivors heal from trauma. So I can go to the next slide. And so I just wanted to highlight a few of the resources, and we'll talk a little bit more about resources later at the end, but creating safer spaces, and I can drop that in here in the chat. This is the program policy. TCFV's program policy manages this website, and it's mainly for programs or for family violence programs around the state, but we have a survivor housing specific page, and you can find some really great resources, reports, charts, things like that. And one piece I want to highlight is regaining balance. So safe and stable housing for survivors of domestic violence. And I'll drop the link in there later. But it was a site interview with about 15 family violence programs that operate housing outside of emergency shelter. And so we did interviews with advocates that work at those programs and combine that with the Texas state plan, survivor and advocate interviews, as well as incorporated evidence-based research around housing and housing assistance, longer term supportive housing for survivors of domestic violence specifically. So, it's a really great read in my opinion, and gives a really great overview of the state of housing for survivors and some of the different barriers that survivors experience as a result of the abuse, and some successful elements or essential elements that contribute to successful longer term housing for survivors. So like I said, I'll drop that in the chat later and encourage y'all to take a look at that. It's got some really great information. And I also wanted to bring up the Housing Beyond Shelter chart, and it is broken down by county and lists all the different family violence programs that might provide, thank you for dropping that in the chat, Jen, and that provide either transitional housing, rapid rehousing, homelessness prevention, a variety of other types of housing outside of emergency shelter. So, if you're in your community and are curious as to what type of housing outside of emergency shelter a program might offer in your area, you can look to that as well. But and then I'll get into this in just on the next slide, but we have a section around survivor rights that lists out state and federal housing protections. And there's also information around lease termination. And we also have, specific domestic violence transitional housing information, research and webinars, things like that. And we also have, lastly, a recentering housing training series that we did last fiscal year, or maybe the fiscal year before that. And but it's a 4-part series that has a really great foundational information, and encourage y'all to take a look at some of those resources there. You can go ahead and move to the next slide. And I just wanted to make sure to make you all aware of those housing protections that are available in Texas, specifically through the property code, as well as some federal housing protections. And I'm not going to go too far into this, but in the property code, Texas property code, the tenants have the right to call the police and call for emergency assistance, and victims can maintain a legal right to summons the police or emergency assistance without fear of penalty. And also in the property code, provides for a victim of family violence, sexual assault, or stalking to terminate their lease. And we have those notice to vacate forms as well as third-party certification forms. And there's also an advocate guide to lease termination. There's a variety of folks that can sign these forms, and so I encourage you to check that out, because those are options for victims if they are feeling unsafe in their home and want to move, or there are even options. And I'll talk about that below, but to bifurcate, a lease. But so with the federal housing protections, there's a federal law, the Violence Against Women Act. And so, the VAWA covered housing programs. How many people type in the chat if say yes or no, if you're a VAWA covered housing program? Or like, I don't know. That's okay too. There's a long list of VAWA, covered housing programs. And, it's usually if there's some sort of subsidized assistance there. So, COCs fall under that, ESGs. There's a variety of different low-income housing tax credits. There's a variety of types of covered housing programs. So, but there are certain rights afforded to victims, and so applicants may not be denied or evicted based on status as a victim. And then you also, as I mentioned, the ability to bifurcate the lease. So, evict, remove, terminate the assistance of the offender if they're also, on the lease, or allow the victim who is the tenant or lawful occupant to remain without penalty. And, and then the landlord is obligated to provide 90 days to establish eligibility for a covered housing for another covered housing program. And then another really important piece for safety under the Violence Against Women Act are emergency transfers. And so this would allow for someone, if they feel unsafe in their home, they are able to use their Section 8 voucher or other type of subsidized assistance and transfer that to another covered housing program. And so we can offer more assistance around that. I know that's not the focus of what we're talking about today, but it is, we just want to make you aware of this, and there is more information on our website about that, and you're welcome to reach out to me or the policy team here for more information about that. And I'll drop my email in the chat right now for that. So you can go to the next slide. It might be, let's see. Yeah.
And I can just jump in here on this slide. This is just a pause point for us to acknowledge through Audre Lorde's great wisdom, who's a feminist and poet, an activist, that there is no thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. So as Molly was sharing all that rich information about the intersection of housing and homelessness and intimate partner violence, I think it's just a moment for us to recognize that, nothing is a single issue, that all of the things we're talking about, the trauma, the effects of trauma, someone's mental health, their housing situation, their economic situation, all of these things intersect and affect a person's ability to be safe, their overall holistic well-being. So just taking a moment to stop and acknowledge that. Yeah, so we can go ahead forward.
You think we have time for the video? I think it's around 2 minutes.
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Homelessness is an issue that far too many people face. People of color, specifically Black people, other persons of color, and Indigenous people, experience homelessness in a dramatically different way than their white counterparts. People who hold multiple identities, such as those who live at the intersections of disability, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and more, experience compounded barriers that further homelessness and housing instability. A recent study found that 66% of people experiencing homelessness were Black, while 28% were white. Black individuals are only 13% of the U.S. general population, compared to 74% of those who are white. Rates of homelessness within Native communities are 3 to 8 times higher than that of the general population. In total, 78% of people experiencing homelessness identified as people of color. This overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color experiencing homelessness cannot be explained by poverty or identity alone. Structural racism, historical policies, institutional practices, and cultural narratives that perpetuate racial inequity put people of color at a disadvantage in obtaining safe and affordable housing. Statistically, women of color are much more likely to experience domestic and sexual violence, and survivors often face network impoverishment. Network impoverishment occurs when the addition of a financially distressed household member places an extra strain on family resources. Oftentimes, we tell a survivor experiencing homelessness to go to a relative or friend's house. However, network impoverishment can cause immense burdens on the existing limited finances and available support from that network. Racial disparities arise at every juncture, from the legal system, to housing, to healthcare, to child welfare, to public benefits. Understanding the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness, and applying an equity, survivor-centered lens in our work is the only pathway to stability, safe housing, and healing for all survivors. If we want to address racial inequity, we have to acknowledge it, learn about it, and talk about it, so we can do more about it together. To learn more, visit safehousingpartnerships.org.
I always like to show that video. I feel like it does a really great job of just highlighting all of the intersections and in a quick, concise, easy to digest type of way. So just things to keep in mind. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Jen.
All right, thanks, Molly. All right, so we're gonna move into for our last couple sections here. We'll talk about disclosures of IPV when someone is sharing with you that that they are experiencing or have experienced intimate partner violence, and then we'll talk about some resources and making connections with survivors to different resources. So so we can go ahead forward. So in your work, maybe you've already, it's likely you've experienced this, and maybe maybe you felt like you did know what to do in this situation, or maybe not. But we're just going to talk a bit about what you can do when someone discloses that they're experiencing intimate partner violence. So first things first, we always, safety is always first. So thinking about if they have any immediate safety concerns, talking with them if they have something, if there's a medical issue that needs to be addressed, something immediate that's going on, certainly that's the priority. Another thing to think about kind of right after immediate safety is privacy and confidentiality concerns. And Brielle's going to talk a little bit more about this, but really this is something that is really important when someone discloses, because family violence centers, the advocates who work there are covered under a privilege statute, which legally prohibits them from disclosing something against somebody's will. So Brielle's going to talk more about that, but we would just encourage you to let survivors know that there is that extra level of privacy and confidentiality when they're working with advocates, and that what they share is more protected when they're disclosing to an advocate, kind of offer that connection. But when you are having that conversation with somebody, obviously listening with empathy and seeking to understand their experience and their needs is key. That's something incredibly valuable that you can offer to somebody, and just being clear about what you can and cannot do, and for the things that you cannot do that they might need, to offer to make those connections to help them access what they need. We can go ahead forward. So in kind of along that same vein there, offering that connection to the local family violence program or the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which could help connect them to the services and programs that they need. It's great if you're able to kind of build your knowledge about your local family violence program, and build up your relationship with them if you haven't already, so that you can kind of explain some of the services that are offered there, or kind of help that person you're working with know a little bit about what to expect, so that it can kind of ease that, that transition of them, making that connection with the family violence program. You can also offer whatever other resources might be needed. Maybe they need to get connected to a coordinated community response team or the district attorney's office if there's, some sort of criminal case pending. Those are things you could offer, but that's also something a family violence program can help to connect the survivor to as well. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about contacting law enforcement or child protective services. Really, whenever possible, this should be something that's the survivor's choice. There may be some rarer situations where contacting law enforcement might be a necessity, or contacting 911 if someone's having a medical emergency, but really it should be a conversation with the survivor before any calls to law enforcement would be made, and with child protective services too. And I'm going to talk a little bit about mandated reporting, but I just want to point out that witnessing domestic violence, so if you're working with a client or survivor who has children, and there's domestic violence happening that they're experiencing, the children witnessing domestic violence in and of itself does not fall under something that's a mandated report. So that's just important to know. And we can move to the next slide to talk a little bit more about this, to kind of engage in mandatory reporting in a trauma-informed way. So really being clear that you are a mandated reporter, that all adults in Texas are mandated reporters, and just kind of explaining that to clients, giving examples of situations that would warrant a report, so people have a better idea of what that means. So giving some hypotheticals, and remembering that for survivors, making a report can increase their safety risks, even though we think of this as something that Sometimes there's this mentality that we might fall into. It's like, oh, better safe than sorry, I better report. But that can actually put someone at a higher risk. And we know that keeping children in the care of their survivor parent, whenever that's possible, helps to keep them safer and does promote their resiliency. So just some things to keep in mind. And if it does come to the point where a report is necessary, that really highlighting the protective factors that survivor parent has showed, things that parent has done to protect their child, sending them to another room or sending them to the neighbor's house or doing different things to try to protect their children's safety within the limits of what was possible for them in different situations. So, and involving them in the reporting process, if that is something you need to do. So I will pass it over now to Brielle to talk in more depth about privacy when it comes to survivors.
Yes, thank you, Jen and Molly, for everything you've shared so far. And I'm just going to give a quick primer around privacy. In our part 2, we'll talk a lot more. So I'm just kind of teeing up the conversation today. But thinking about when a survivor discloses to you, or you're working with the survivor in housing, privacy is incredibly important to think about and to keep at the forefront, because for survivors, privacy equals safety. It equates to safety in so many different ways. If you think back to that, the power and control wheel, thinking about the control of information and what survivors are able to do or not do, right? Or what information they have control over in that situation is not a lot, right? If they don't even have control over their finances, sometimes their sanity, right? Their physical space. So to be able to give back control, even in as the thing around information and what they decide to share with you, is so important. Also, sharing certain information could lead to unsafe and dangerous situations. Say they have left the abuser and have a different contact information, right, or a different address, and in the wrong hands, that could mean that that they are put in a dangerous situation or sensitive information about themselves, right? So a survivor-centered model always means that the survivor is in control of what information is shared and with whom, as they're the experts in knowing their own needs and their own what could compromise their safety. When we think about survivors in crisis, especially unhoused survivors, and the services that you all provide, whether that be mental health or domestic violence services, housing services, it's very possible that they will tell you anything to get those services, to get those resources, right? And so to make sure that we recognize that power dynamic that we hold as the service providers, and help them understand what is needed to receive services and what is not, and where they have control and options. As Jen alluded to, family violence programs have unique and enhanced privacy and privilege obligations to survivors. A family violence program really is one of the only resources available to survivors that is completely confidential, and therefore, as we discussed, crucial to their safety, right? It is the one place where you can go and say that they have very, very few exceptions to when they are allowed to share information widely. So we have federal statute like Violence Against Women Act, Victim of Crime Act, Family Violence Prevention and Services Act that say if a program receives grant funding, they cannot share personally identifying information without a release of information. That probably sounds familiar. And then we have the Texas Privilege Statute that Jen mentioned, that says communication between a survivor and advocate is privileged and confidential. So these are enhanced to what we would talk about of general privacy and confidentiality that family violence programs must follow. We know that this is also why they don't participate in HMIS. We will talk a lot more about that in part 2, right? These are the reasons why they cannot enter information into HMIS. And I know that these statutes feel like a barrier sometimes, or can, but there are ways to still continue to communicate and collaborate, and support survivors. I think in all of this, thinking about trauma, thinking about a trauma-informed model, and it comes down to choice, right? A lot of the time, especially in survivor-centered models, we want to be able to give survivors choices in what works for them, depending on their needs and the impact of their trauma. And so there are ways that victim service providers and mental health providers and homelessness programs can all work together with these privacy and confidentiality requirements that family violence programs hold, but still build successful relationships, and support survivors and create processes that work while still holding safety and privacy at the forefront. So think about that for part 2. That's kind of what I'll leave you with. Think about how you work with your VSPs now. What can you learn from each other to create those processes that make it easier to work together? How do you talk about collaboration and survivor support? And we will talk about it more in part 2. And I hope I didn't take too much time, but I'll pass it over to Jen, I believe.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Brielle. It's really important information to have and a good setup for what's to come in part 2. So we have a very quick poll for you all to take. So if you, hopefully you have your cell phone nearby, and you can pull it out and open up the camera and scan this QR code, and it should bring up a little website you can click on, and that will take you to a 2-question poll. So if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and scan the code, and then we're going to get some results in real time here. So just a couple of questions about, if you are familiar with the Family Violence Center in your area, and if you have a relationship with them. So I'll give you a couple minutes to go ahead and do that. If you're having any issues with it, let us know. Drop it in the chat. This is our first time using this. It connects with Qualtrics, so we're okay. Rebecca, you're joining from your phone. Okay. Well, I will drop the questions in the chat too. Oh, I'm so sorry, Rebecca. You're at home with the flu. Hope you feel better soon.
Looks like Craig dropped there you go, the link in as well to the survey.
Yeah, thanks, Craig.
You're welcome. I may steal this little tool from y'all. I like live results.
Yeah.
Is stuff coming in, Jen? Can you see it?
I'm
in
just
real
about
time?
to, it's refreshing here.
Okay.
Ooh, okay. Yes, we're seeing some results.
Woo.
Ooh, they're looking great. We've got 14 so far. Just give y'all another minute or so, 30 seconds to put in your responses. We should have put a little music in this spot here. That would have been nice.
That does feel appropriate.
Okay. Let me refresh one more time. Okay, so what I'm seeing in the poll results So for the first question, do you know the family violence organization in your service area? We had 19 people saying yes and 0 people saying no. So
Okay.
that's fabulous news. And then for the second question, do you or does your agency have a relationship with the local family violence organization? And we get another 19 yeses and 0 no's. So
Wow,
it
all
looks like
right.
y'all are very connected to your family violence centers, which is great news.
That is.
Yeah.
And you let us test out our new survey tool.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thanks for participating in that.
Yes.
So we can go ahead forward. Right. I'm throwing it back over to you.
Okay, yeah, I was like, I think it's me. Okay, so, I'm very excited that all of you know who your programs are and that you have a relationship with them. And we want to help strengthen that, or, if you need help with that at all, we're here to help and continue to support you, because you all probably serve multiple counties and, different things like that too. So, just reach out to us if you ever have difficulty. But we kind of wanted to give you some basic information around, like, what do family violence programs do? What can someone expect? Things like that. And so, most programs that are funded through the Health and Human Services Commission Family Violence Program offer 24-hour emergency shelter and a 24-hour hotline, and a variety of other services, around crisis intervention, safety planning. And those services look different based on, the resources and funding at each program. But, there's typically legal advocacy, counseling, children's advocacy, and a lot of other types of services that programs offer. And a lot of programs have dedicated housing advocates and some do not, so the landscape's going to look really different based on, the program. So just know that, getting to know your local program will help you be able to offer to survivors what to expect in a better way. And so, usually when someone calls the program or a hotline, there's an emergency shelter option. And, we talked about, unmet needs earlier around emergency shelter and housing. And, we have a what we call a turnaway rate. That's the right term, right, Braille? Yeah. And, and so, when someone calls a hotline, the percentage is around 48% right now. It's gone up just a little bit, but, we're trying to tease that out based on areas of the state as well. So it could look different based on your area. In the more rural areas, there might be a little more availability versus like the urban areas. But a lot of times shelters get full. And so when someone calls, they might hear on the other end, like, we don't have space here, and but we can refer you to another program. And that's up to the survivor to decide whether or not, if they're ready to to leave their community or the place that they called. So and another thing to expect when someone goes to the program, all services are voluntary. So we do not require any type of service, someone to attend, counseling for this, or, attend a class for that. So everything is totally voluntary. And, as Jen has been mentioning, everything is trauma informed. So, we use that trauma informed. I've heard the term recently, trauma responsive, which I really like and embracing. So, might not just be informed about it, but we're responding with that trauma informed lens as well. So, and it's really up to the advocate to talk through options and offer options. But, as Brielle mentioned earlier, offering that choice and that autonomy and giving agency back to the survivor, and not to reconstruct that power and control that they've experienced in their intimate partner relationship. So, that's the basis of where we operate from at programs. And so, how can your agency collaborate with the family violence program? It sounds like y'all are doing that, but there are typically like community coalitions, but even just setting up a meeting with the executive director or the advocate that or the advocate that you might know as the housing advocate, or that you've interacted with in other spaces around the community. And finding out if there's a liaison or point of contact that someone else in your agency might know about. And so I feel like things just really boil down to relationships. The older I get, the more that's just solidified for me. But we can help facilitate that relationship too, if anyone needs help with that or wants to grow that relationship. We can kind of talk through that and help facilitate that. And so Brielle or Jen, do y'all have, what are there other things that you think you might add to kind of what to expect, or when someone calls, or what programs offer?
I think I would just say, well, one, just to give a little more context about that turnaway rate. So Molly gave you a little bit of a sneak peek of our new data that we're still analyzing. So I wouldn't use that number specifically.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's totally okay. That's totally okay. But last fiscal year, we reported around 39% of clients who called family violence programs were denied shelter solely due to lack of space. So there are other reasons, that they might be denied, but that's the number for, they just don't have a bed available, right? We're looking at this for FY22. We're still analyzing it. It definitely will be higher, but it's a lot of the time in the metro areas, right? Where I think we all know that housing is very rare at the moment, and it's really a struggle. But oh shoot, what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, we also know that survivors may not feel comfortable reaching out to a family violence program. So we'll talk about that more in part 2, but I did just want to mention, I appreciate all of you being here also, because you can offer that choice and know that they might not choose it. And y'all being here means that you want to be that supportive and trauma informed as you serve them within your own individual programs. So, but yes, they all are a great place to connect to and build those relationships with.
Thanks, Brielle. I appreciate you clarifying that. Well, unless Jen has something else to add, I know we only have a few minutes left, and I saw it in the chat. Let's see, is it protocol to put the survivor in a different county from where their abuser is? As I mentioned, it would be up to the survivor to make that choice, and kind of, they might want to stay in the same community where their other family members or their children are going to school, and things like that. And so you would safety plan around that, and maybe still being in contact with the abuser, because a lot of times survivors don't have the choice to not be in contact with the abuser, especially if they shared custody with a child or have children, or just in a smaller community. So we really leave that up to to the survivor to make that choice on what's safest for them, because we do also operate from the survivor is the expert over their own lives. So but that's a great question, so thank you. That, and for some reason I can't see the next one. Can anybody else see what the next question is? I can't draw it down.
It was Mary saying that they're excited for Brielle to be serving seat 6, which
Oh,
represents the victim service providers on the upcoming Texas Balanced Estate Continuum of Care Board.
Nice shout out, Mary. I love that.
Thank you. I'm excited to join.
That's awesome. Okay, and I also wanted to share the service directory link. Let me see, I don't think I have that one just yet, but it was updated in 2019, but it is still up to date with the programs and phone numbers and websites and things like that. But I just want to make sure that you all have this in case you are working with a survivor that might want to go to a different area, or you're serving a county that you might not know where the family violence program is. Oh, that's not the right website link. Let me see. That is our Housing Beyond
Jen
Shelter
got
chart.
it.
though. You got
Jen
it,
got
Jen?
it.
Okay, thank you. Yes. And as Jen mentioned earlier, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, if you don't give another resource, this is a great resource. As she mentioned, they can connect directly to local programs and other resources. They will talk to survivors. They will talk to persons using abuse. They will talk to family members, providers. And they're there 24/7, 365. You can text or chat or call. There's a lot of great options there, but it's an amazing resource where they have trained advocates that can do safety planning over the phone or text or chat, or, just kind of talk through options. And especially, the 24/7 is a really great option. I know we have 1 minute, so we can go ahead and go to the next. But and again, we already offered this in a previous slide, but and I dropped the survivor housing link in the chat. So I encourage y'all to check that out and reach out to us with any questions. And I thank Brielle and Jen and Hope and Craig and everyone for being here today. And we look forward.
And one last plug.
Yeah.
TCFV is in the middle of our Purple Postcard campaign.
Yes,
It's our biggest campaign to support funding for family violence services. So we know that there's a need for more services, more shelter, more housing. So you've seen us sitting in this lilac all for the last hour and a half. Please go to tcfv.org/purple postcard to sign your postcard and support funding for survivor services.
Thank
Then
you.
links in your chat now.
Thank
Okay,
you.
good. I was like,
I was like, I can't read that small.
thank you, Brielle, for mentioning that. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for being here with us today. Reach out to us if we can be of help, be of support. Thanks for being
Register. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry,
here.
Jen.
I'm good. I'm done.
I was gonna say register for part 2.
Yes.
So excited to see y'all in part 2. And thank you so much, Texas Council on Family Violence, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, y'all. With that,